Okay, I want to say thank you for everyone for coming out. I really appreciate you showing up here. I also want to say thank you to Crystal and to the Sacred Student Alliance for inviting me. It's my second time speaking here. It was a pleasure the first time, and I hope it will be a pleasure again, both for myself and for you all. The title of my talk today, as Crystal said, is Dying Without God. And a bit of a precursor on the material here. This stuff is simultaneously sort of the culmination of a wide variety of random thoughts that have been accumulating in my head over several years. But it's also the first time I've sort of presented it in this format. So it is kind of rough, not necessarily the most well-articulated or polished. So any critical feedback you guys have, either on content or delivery, I would appreciate very much. So do please, when it comes time for the question and answer, don't pull your punches, don't pull back, don't feel you need to be polite. This is the period and the juncture in which the best gift you can give to me is your critical response. So I would appreciate that very much. Okay, so let's get to it. I want to start off with the bad news, because whenever you're giving a talk on death, there's always bad news. The bad news is that everyone you love will die. You probably knew this already. I don't think I'm breaking any new ground here. But it is important, I think, to start off by putting this on the table. It's probably also going to happen sooner than you imagine. We have a really bad tendency to sort of create the illusion of a life going on forever. So it's a good idea to remind us that life is briefer than we often imagine it. We go through it very fast and it ends very abruptly. So apologies for that. There's also, of course, the fact that needs to be thrown in there. You are going to die. And once more, also probably sooner than you realize. Coming to terms with this is an incredibly difficult thing to do, psychologically, emotionally, socially, religiously, and any number of other ways in which we try to cope with it. So I want to open up with the apologies for the bad news. And I suppose it's probably also only fair to mention that the puppy's going to die too. So sorry for that stuff. But there's also good news, and the good news is that you'll get over it. You'll get over the fact that people you love will die, and you'll get over the fact that you will die. If nothing else, you'll get over the fact that you will die on the day that you die, or at least the moment after you die. One way or another, you're going to get over this fact. One way or another, the day will come when you are no longer upset by the fact of your own mortality and the mortality of everyone you love. Death isn't necessarily as bad as we sometimes imagine it to be. So consider, for example, the research of Harvard psychologist Daniel Gilbert, who did a really interesting, albeit kind of morbid experiment, in which he went around to a large group of people, and he said, I want you to imagine that your child has just died. A year goes by, how do you feel? And of course, when presented with the situation, people said, oh, I feel terrible, I feel horrible, the death of my child, what could possibly be worse than that? People anticipated that they would feel devastated well over a year after the death of their child. And then he went around and he compared those responses with people who actually had lost a child, 1 year later, 2 years later. And it turned out that most people who have lost a child, while obviously it's still affected by the loss of their child, were nowhere near as devastated as the prior group anticipated they would be. Life goes on, as we say. Now, again, this is not to marginalize the tragedy of the death of a child, but it is simply to point out that the empirical psychological research seems to suggest that we are better at coping with death than we imagine ourselves to be. I'm going to come back to that psychological point here in just a moment, but I do want to make a terminological clarification here, because sometimes having this conversation can be difficult because, as so often is the case, words are ambiguous and can mean different things. So I want to make a distinction between two different senses of the word dying. In one sense of the word dying, you cannot die with God, and at least in the sort of traditional religious, in particular the Christian tradition. There is no such thing as death under at least certain interpretations of the Christian religion and other religions as well. Eternal life is really kind of the whole spiel, right? He that liveth and believeth in me, though shall he lives, he shall never die, all that stuff. If this vision of life and the afterlife is true, death isn't really death. I mean, it's death in one sense of the word, but it's not death in another sense of the word. So in a certain sense, the whole debate about whether or not God exists is a debate about whether or not we can die at all. Die in the sense here of the complete annihilation of the person. If the Christian story is right, then that kind of death never happens. One way or the other, you live forever. The biological organism that you are may expire, but your soul lives on. So in this sense of the word, the alternative to dying without God is simply not dying at all. dying would be impossible on this sort of mainstream understanding. So for clarity here, I want to make a distinction between capital D dying and lowercase d dying. I'm going to use the capital D dying to refer to that utter annihilation of the person, where the person ceases to exist in any meaningful sense of the term. And then the lowercase d dying will refer to the end of the biological organism, which may or may not, depending on your point of view, equate with capital D dying. But I want to simply have the terminological distinction there. So I will refer throughout this talk to capital D dying versus lowercase d dying. It might get a little tedious, I apologize for that, but this is, I want to have the distinction in place so there is no confusion as to what sense of the word it is I am referring to. So, one of the most famous statements in the history of philosophy comes from Socrates, who says that the purpose of philosophy is to prepare us for death. And this is a sentiment that has been echoed by philosophers throughout history. The Roman philosopher Cicero later stated, about a couple hundred years after Socrates, that to philosophize is to learn how to die. And a little more than 1,000 years after Cicero, the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne wrote an essay of that exact same thing. He stole that phrase from Cicero and wrote a whole essay, to philosophize is to learn how to die. It's an excellent essay, and it's a part of the tradition in the history of philosophy about understanding the relationship between the meaning of life, the meaning of death, the afterlife, and of course philosophy. Now, the interesting thing from my point of view is all three of these figures, Socrates, Cicero, and Michel de Montaigne, they all believe in an afterlife in some variety or another. Socrates and Cicero did not believe in the Christian afterlife. Montaigne certainly did. But they all believe in some sense of a life beyond this one, an immortality of the soul. And I find this interesting because, obviously, if they are correct, if there is an eternal afterlife, then what it means to prepare yourself for death is going to be very, very different than what it means to prepare yourself for death if there is no afterlife. The sense of preparing yourself for death in which those three figures are working with is going to be notably different than the sense in which I am. And, for Socrates, Cicero, and Montaigne, it's all about preparing your soul for eternity, for getting it into a position where, once you die, whatever happens next you are ready for. It should come without surprise to all of you based on the title of my talk. I'm going to propose, not a novel hypothesis of course, but I'm going to propose that there is nothing after death, that once we die, we are gone. It is the capital D death, the utter annihilation of the person. And if that is correct, then preparing ourselves for death is going to be a very different kind of experience, a very different kind of process than if we have to prepare our souls for the afterlife in some way. So, it seems to me that, this approach to thinking, again, thinking of death as the lowercase d death, is a perpetuation of the denial of death. The idea that we never actually die, because we will survive the death of the biological organism. So the idea of an eternal life, true or false, whether or not there is an eternal life, can be psychologically, I think, very, very dangerous and very, very damaging to us. If we take this notion seriously, we're going to live our lives in certain ways that are not necessarily going to be healthy. Either because we will be living in a sort of schizophrenic state where we claim to accept the reality of death, but we do not, in fact, actually accept the reality of death, or because we honestly do accept the reality of death, and the consequences of that for our life will be profound indeed, as I will argue as we go forward. On the psychologist side of the coin, psychologists, since at least as far back as Freud, have argued that the fear of death is one of the primary human drives. It's one of the things that move us beyond anything else. Basically, the only thing that was more potent than death, according to Freud, was sex. Anthropologists have claimed that the fear of death is a human universal, that it's something you find everywhere you go, all times, all people are constantly, always afraid of death. Now, some people claim to not be afraid of death, but according to this school of thought, these people are in denial, they're sublimating their fear, but they're not really dispelling it. They're not really overcoming their fear. The fear is still there. They've just pushed it down to the point where they're not facing up to it, and they're not being honest with themselves about the fact that they will die. So I think it's worth asking the question, whether or not this is correct, whether or not it is in fact a human universal. What is it the case? What is it about death that is so scary? Why are we afraid to die? That might seem like sort of a no-brainer question, but I really think that if we spend a little bit of time reflecting on it, we'll realize that death in some senses is scary, but in other senses is not so scary at all. And if we can try to sort of figure out a way to balance these two different approaches, these two different attitudes we have towards death, maybe we can find a happy medium in there somewhere. So I like to appeal to the British poet John Donne here, who wrote a poem some of you are no doubt familiar with. Donne says, "Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind." I find this to be a rather beautiful sentiment, especially when you read it in the context of the full poem. But to be honest, I'm not entirely sure it's true, at least not in the universal, where it says, each man's death diminishes me. Presumably he means by that each and every man's death, and presumably every woman's death as well, diminishes him. I'm not sure that's actually true, either for Donne or for me or for anyone else for that matter. Take, for example, the death of John Donne. Died over like 400 years ago, something like that. That doesn't seem to have diminished me in any way. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not meaning to marginalize or dismiss the man's life or his works or his death. Now, maybe I'm diminished by the fact that he didn't live a little bit longer, write a few more poems. My life might have been richer had he done that and had I read those poems. So I might be diminished by something that he would have done were he to live, but his death per se doesn't seem to have diminished me at all. It's just sort of the thing that you would expect from a poet who lived about 400 years ago. And I want to say this sort of points us towards something of a paradox in our psychology about death. The gulf of time depersonalizes death. It makes it far less of a tragedy. You can say that about Donne's death, you can say it about Shakespeare's, Beethoven's, Michelangelo's. Again, I do wish these people had lived longer and written more and done more work. That would have made my life richer. But the fact of their death by itself does not diminish me, because I know that one way or the other, they were bound to die by this point in time. No one who lived back then could possibly still be alive today. They were bound to die sooner or later. It was an inevitability. So I'm more or less okay with it. This is the way of all flesh. There's a scene in the Oliver Stone movie, U-Turn, where Sean Penn is at a bar with Claire Danes, and Claire Danes says, "Don't you just love Patsy Cline? I wonder why she don't put out more records." And Sean Penn says, "Because she's dead." To which Claire Danes says, "Oh, that's so sad. Don't that make you sad?" Sean Penn says, "I kind of had some time to get over it." And that's more or less the attitude I think we take with the death of the vast majority of humanity. I mean, really, when you stop and think about it, billions of people have been alive, and billions of them have died. And most of us have not spared a thought, not even a split second worth of a thought for any of those people. Those people's deaths have not diminished us at all, because they have not made contact with our lives in any way possible. So you contrast this with, once again, that primal diminishment, that utter devastation that you get when you think about the death of your own child. That's the kind of death that diminishes you, to put it mildly. But the death of some 14th century French peasant, whose name I've never heard of before, who's left absolutely no mark on history in any way, who it's impossible for me to come in any sort of contact with. I'm not meaning to trivialize the significance of that human being's life. Obviously it was important to them, but it does not diminish me, in virtue of the fact that there is this incredible gulf of time. So this is the psychological paradox that I want to try to draw your attention to about death. It is simultaneously horrifying and banal. Once in the same breath. We're really, really good at getting over death. We're really, really good at coming to terms with death. But we're really, really bad at recognizing the fact that we'll come to terms with death. We're really, really bad at projecting ourselves into the future to a time in which we are dealing with the death and thinking, how will I cope with that? Prior to it happening, death is one of the worst things we can imagine. After it happening, it's just sort of how things go. It's not necessarily something we're happy about, but it is something we come to terms with. And we are pretty good at coming to terms with it, even if we don't realize that fact. Now, if you know that Donne poem, you might know the next line in the poem. Say not to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I think that actually hits the nail a little bit closer to the head, to my sentiments here. I think the reason why that line echoes so well throughout history is because it does touch on something which is profoundly important about our relationship to death. And that is to say that when we hear about people dying, even if when I simply mention about that 14th century French peasant who died several hundred years ago, it reminds us of our own mortality. And being reminded of our own mortality, having memento mori, is something that can indeed resonate with us in a way that's not necessarily comfortable. It can be difficult to deal with emotionally. And it is this sort of personal, intense, intimate sense of death that I think is really what scares us. This is what moves us and drives us in the way that Freud was talking about. Really, when you think about it, death is only scary in a fairly limited context. It's only scary when we think about the people that we love dying and thought that we someday will die. I mean, it is somewhat scary when thinking about the death of people that we've never met before in foreign countries. You know, if I were to open up the newspaper tomorrow and find out that there was a train wreck and 600 people died, you know, I would be upset by that, certainly. I would feel diminished, to use Dunn's word. But I would feel nowhere near the horror if it turned out that one of my friends had been on that train. That would be a profoundly different emotional experience than if it were 600 strangers. So it is that balance between the intimacy of death and the universality of death that creates this sort of paradox. Now, Freud, like as David Hume beforehand, claimed that this sort of fear of death was the reason ultimately why people invented gods and why they invented an afterlife, because the fear of death was so profound, it was so paralyzing, that they had to sublimate that fear somehow, and otherwise they would not be able to go on with their living. So they create the idea of an afterlife, so that way they never have to die, so they don't have to worry about it, they don't have to think about it, they can relax and get on with their mundane, day-to-day existence. Now, there might be some truth to this, but at a minimum, I think it is oversimplistic. I think there's a lot more going on to the notion of life after death than simply the fear of death in this way where I don't want to cope with it, I don't want to come to terms with it. No doubt that's present for some people some of the time, but it cannot possibly be an adequate picture of the entire understanding of life, of our relationship to and our thinking about death and life after death. So, again, don't get me wrong here. Again, I'm not meaning to suggest that death is trivial or can be ignored or isn't or ought to be scary. Death is legitimately a source of anxiety and fear and pain. I'm sure all of you have had someone in your life die, and that is an incredibly difficult thing to deal with, and I'm not meaning to marginalize your pain or my own for that matter. And so I do think that the prospect of having, of dying with God, either my own personal dying with God or my friends dying with God, is something that it makes sense on the surface. I understand why people find this position attractive. Now, I want to be clear here about what I'm intending to do. I'm not arguing at this point that it's false. I'm not saying that we have good reason for thinking that there is no afterlife. That's a separate topic. I'm talking here principally about the psychological and the existential consequences of thinking this to be true. So it might turn out that it is true, but it might also turn out that in spite of being true, it's bad for us to believe that it's true. It's bad for us to act as though it were true. And that is more my focus here on out today, focusing on the psychological and the existential consequences of this belief. And it might seem like one of the consequences is solace and comfort in the face of death. And sociologically speaking, this is undeniably true. I mean, when people die, they comfort each other. The survivors comfort each other by saying things like, well, he's in a better place now. You don't have to be a social scientist to have picked up on this pattern. But in spite of that sort of superficial appeal, I think if we reflect a little bit more deeply on precisely what it means to talk about dying with God, lowercase d, dying with God there, it's going to turn out to not be as attractive as it initially seems. So in spite of that superficial attractiveness, it's going to turn out that underneath the surface, it's really not a very attractive notion at all. So that is what I'm principally going to argue. My principal thesis for here today is to say that dying, lowercase d, dying with God, is not as appealing as it appears at first glance. And by contrast, capital D dying, with the complete and total annihilation of the person, dying without God, is actually preferable. That it is better for us emotionally, psychologically, sociologically, better for us in any number of dimensions to hope that one day we will be completely annihilated, that we will cease to exist, and that we will not perpetuate on into infinity and any sort of afterlife. So why die with God? If the Freudian picture is the Freudian/Jungian picture about fear of death is only part of the story, what is a larger, maybe not the whole story, but at least a larger take on the story? I want to identify 5 different things that I think makes the notion of dying with God appealing. First off, the notion that the party doesn't end. Life is awesome, life is fun, death cuts it short. That sucks. It would be awesome if the party didn't have to end. The second is the notion of reunion with loved ones. As I said, I've lost loved ones, and I'm sure you have too. The prospect of seeing them again is definitely something that is appealing and that is attractive. So I can see how that's part of the sales pitch as well. Next up is the notion of divine justice. There are people who are evil people in this world, and they often escape secular justice. And that's unfair. Wouldn't it be awesome and nice if they ultimately got what was coming to them? And by the flip side of that as well. There are heroic, brave, awesome people who never get the recognition or the reward that they deserve. Wouldn't it be fantastic if they got a reward after they shuffled loose this moral coil? Fourth is the notion that the afterlife gives us some sort of ultimate meaning, some sort of profound purpose, some sort of way to overcome the absurdity of our existence. And then the fifth is the notion that if we die with God, we can get the answer to all of life's great mysteries. The things that perplex us and puzzle us need not perplex and puzzle us anymore. It will all be resolved, and we will understand that life, the universe, and everything when we die with God. Now, I want to take all five of these proposals seriously, because I do think that all five of these things are attractive. All five of these things do make sense. But ultimately, I wish to argue that all five will fail. I kind of want to divide them into two basic groups. I think the first three I want to call sort of the pragmatic reasons. And then the final two I want to call the existential reasons. I'm not entirely sure exactly the nature of this division here, but something about that division jumped out. These two did seem different than those three. I'm a little hesitant on that, so if anyone has any thoughts on a better way to parse out these five things, I'd be happy to hear them at the end. But I want to go through all five of these in some detail, hopefully being charitable to each of these five reasons, and then saying why I do not think ultimately it's a convincing reason to find the notion of dying with God appealing. So, starting with the first, the notion that the party should go on forever. I'm a fan of life. I think life is fantastic and awesome and beautiful. I find so much to enjoy and to appreciate in life. And I don't think I'm alone in this. Most people, it seems to me, enjoy living and want to go on living. And we take considerable efforts to avoid death. Everything from looking both ways before we cross the street, to eating every day, to taking any variety of medicines. We spend an awful lot of our time and efforts trying to avoid death. And that's presumably, at least in part, because we enjoy life. Wouldn't it be fantastic if life didn't have to end? If life could go on forever? If we could reach actuarial escape velocity, if I can steal a phrase, and just go on living forever? Eternity with God, in this respect, seems to extend the party on in perpetuity. Everything that's good in life doesn't just get amplified, it gets extended on into infinity. What could be more awesome than that? And I think, again, while this is an appealing notion, it fails to recognize something that I think most of us recognize in other contexts, and that's the notion that too much of a good thing can be quite terrible indeed. It is nice to have some things that are only finite in nature, that are only limited. I mean, take, for example, I'm not a golfer, but this seems like a nice example. Say that you love golf. Say golf is your favorite thing to do in the world. You spend all your free time doing golf, all your money on golf. Golf is your thing. You die, you get to go play golf with Jesus. How awesome would that be, right? You know, you get to play golf on courses that are more grand and more beautiful and more challenging than any earthly terrestrial golf course. Wow, that's awesome. Now you play golf for 1 billion years. You've gotten to the point now where you've mastered every single possible configuration of golf course. You can hit hole-in-one on every single hole. Think you're still going to enjoy golf very much after all of that? I don't imagine you will. It seems to me that golf would get pretty boring after that. And of course, it's not just golf, right? Then you can move on to something else. You can go on to playing poker or something, or basketball. But again, play that for 1 billion years, and then play poker for 1 billion years, and keep going for 1 billion years, and you know what? You still have eternity to look forward to. It never, ever stops. This is what Tom Stoppard said. Eternity is a terrible thought. I mean, where is it going to end? So I think it seems to me that if you really enjoy life, it is better overall that it is finite. Maybe life would be better if we could live a little bit longer, if we could live 1,000 years, or even 100,000 years, even 1 million years. Maybe there's enough to enjoy in this world that we could live for 1 million years, we could still continue to relish it. But the second it becomes eternal, that's when it ceases to be so enjoyable. It seems to me that infinity destroys the possibility of value. It is only rare things, finite things, only temporary things that can be precious to us. This is going to be a point I'm going to return to later on, so I'll echo this sentiment in response to some of the other 5 points. This is a sentiment, by the way, which I think was fantastically captured by the late Christopher Hitchens in his memoir, and I want to quote from him directly. The clear awareness of having been born into a losing struggle need not lead one into despair. I do not especially like the idea that one day I shall be tapped on the shoulder and informed not that the party is over, but that it is most assuredly going on, only henceforth in my absence. Much more horrible, though, would be the announcement that the party is continuing forever, and I was forbidden to leave. Whether it was a hellishly bad party, or a party that was perfectly heavenly in every respect, the moment that it became eternal and compulsory would be the precise moment that it began to pall. And, of course, shortly after he wrote those words, Hitchens himself died. So one can only sort of hope and assume that he was able to take that attitude with him into and through the deathbed. Okay, what about the prospect of meeting up with loved ones after they die? That is, again, I've said this a couple of times now, but it is worth repeating because every time I think about it, I imagine people I've lost. I imagine my friends and my family members. And I think about the idea of having just one more day with them, just being able to see them one more time, have one last conversation, one last hug. I mean that it seriously knocks me back on my heels because that I feel the reality and the desire and the pull for that so much. Who wouldn't want to see their loved ones again? That idea is definitely something I think we should take quite seriously. That sort of communion is a powerful, powerful thing. C.S. Lewis, for the record, the Christian philosopher and novelist C.S. Lewis, was skeptical of this notion. In his book, A Grief Observed, which is a book I would recommend to all of you, I think it is a fantastic book, and one of the best books written on the topic of death from any perspective, theist, atheist, Christian, non-believer, or otherwise. There was a collection of his journals that he wrote when his wife died, and there's some of the most just heart-wrenchingly honest and soul-searching reflections on the nature of death that I have ever read, and so it is a favorite book of mine. And he says in that book, "Talk to me about the truth of religion, and I'll listen gladly. Talk to me about the duty of religion, and I'll listen submissively. But don't come talking to me about the consolations of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand." Now, please don't be misled by what I'm saying here. Lewis, at no point in this book, contemplates atheism or abandons his Christianity, and ultimately, again, the resolution of the Grief Observed is him sort of coming back into terms and making sense in his own way of his faith and how that relates vis-a-vis to the death of his wife. So I don't mean to misrepresent what he's saying here. But I, too, am skeptical, not for the same reasons that Lewis was, but I, too, am skeptical that this notion is actually a healthy approach. Because really, would you want to spend eternity with your mother-in-law? I love my mother-in-law. I happen to be very lucky. My wife's family is excellent. My mother-in-law loves me. But, at the same time, after going home for Christmas, spending 2 weeks in the area, it kind of gets to the point where I'm ready to go back to be not around her. And this is sort of just a tease or a hint at the nature of the problems that arise here. Think, for example, what about second marriages? I'm married, very happily so. I love my wife very much. But in the thinking back to the puppy, I recognize it's quite possible that she might die, and she might die sooner than I imagine. And if she does, that will, of course, devastate me. But the prospect of marrying again is certainly a real one. It might happen. So if I get married a second time after my first wife dies, what happens when then I die and my second wife dies? And then all three of us end up in heaven together? That seems kind of like an awkward situation. Do we all become Mormons in the afterlife or something like that? I mean, was Joseph Smith onto something that way? I don't know. And it is difficult for me to imagine how there could be a graceful resolution to this. I mean, I can imagine some sort of some sort of brainwashing technique in which the possessiveness and the interpersonal relationships we have here on Earth cease to be in heaven, where we just become sort of all one big communal family or something like that. But, that to me not only seems kind of ad hoc, it seems like we're losing something really important there if we do wipe away those kind of interpersonal relationships. And then what about unrequited love? What if the person who you love doesn't love you back? What if the person who you want to spend eternity with doesn't want to spend eternity with you? And that cuts both ways. Again, there's the prospect of the people that you want to spend eternity with don't want to spend eternity with you. And then it's also the other side of the coin. What if the people who want to spend eternity with you are the people that you don't want to spend eternity with? How is this resolved? In anything other than a magic poof, you your personality and your personal relationships just disappear, and suddenly you just love everybody equally kind of fashion. That sort of magic trick seems to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We lose the very thing that we're trying to preserve, namely the importance of our interpersonal relationships. If those interpersonal relationships matter in this life, then they have to be preserved in the next life. Otherwise, there's no point to this aspect of the afterlife, at least. Another version of this problem actually is proposed by the novelist Richard Matheson in his book, What Dreams May Come, and also the movie based on the novel starring Robin Williams. I call this the division problem, and I think it is a particularly intriguing proposal. And the proposal is this: what happens if I die and go to heaven, but then my wife, or my mother, or my father, or my children, my best friend, or whomever, what if they don't go to heaven? What if they end up in hell? Now, in the novel, there is a very heroic story about the character played by Robin Williams descends into hell to try to save his wife. And it's a great story, but theologically speaking, it seems to be kind of iffy at best. I mean, I can imagine several possibilities. Oh, okay, I'm sorry, the picture was not supposed to come back. I can imagine several possibilities for how this could be resolved. Maybe when you get to heaven, you just stop caring about the other people. Maybe they're down in hell, but it doesn't matter because you're palling around with God, and nothing could make you happier. You completely stop caring. It's a possibility. Or maybe a simulacra of them is created to placate you. So there's a being that looks just like my wife and talks just like my wife and sounds just like, it's not really my wife. My wife's really down in hell, but I can't tell the difference because they have this perfect replica of her up here in heaven. I mean, that if I didn't know the difference, it probably I would be placated by that, presumably. There's a possibility. Maybe my wife would be like, even though she's on whatever standard of judgment she deserves to go to hell, but she gets brought into heaven for my sake, because I get into heaven, so she's my +1, as it were. That would solve the problem too. Or maybe I would just have to suck it up and deal. Maybe I would have to just come to terms with the fact that I'm no longer going to spend any time with my wife. Eternity without her is where I'm at. Or there's also, of course, the possibility that everyone gets into heaven, that no one is kept out. Every single person, regardless of how they live their life, regardless of who they are is led to heaven. Now, any one of these things, to me, seems like it would indeed solve a problem, in terms of just the basic intellectual problem. But none of them seem compatible with, for starters, the sort of typical Judeo-Christian Islamic vision of the afterlife that is passed on to us. Nor does it seem compatible with the notion of heaven as a perfect place. If we want to hold on to that idea, if we want to believe that heaven is perfection, then I don't think we can go with any of these options. And if none of these options are going to work, then I am very puzzled to know what else it could be. How could we have heaven? How could heaven possibly exist if the people that we care about the most are going to be kept from us for whatever reason? Okay. On to point 3, the notion of God's divine justice. Once more, it's undeniable to me that there are wicked people in this world, and these wicked people often escape justice here on earth. They do horrible things to people, to animals, to themselves even, and they never in any way come to any sort of reconciliation. They never have to pay the piper. The scales of justice are never rebalanced. The German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant actually argued that it is precisely for this reason that there must be an afterlife, because our sense of justice is so profound, it is so powerful that you can't explain where that sense of justice would come from if we did not know in our heart of hearts that ultimately when we die we will be judged accordingly. So the only way to explain that sense of justice, that desire for justice, that yearning for justice, is if there was a divine judge that gave everyone ultimately what they were due. Now, I want to sort of flip this over. It seems to me that very straightforward that if eternity is what we're talking about, then with eternity there can be no justice. No one on this planet is wicked enough to deserve eternal punishment, and no one is righteous enough to deserve eternal bliss. One way or the other, people are not going to be getting what they deserve. Now again, maybe people can deserve bliss for a very long time. Maybe people can deserve torment for a very long time. 100 million years in hell. That's a long time. Maybe that's what Hitler deserves. Maybe he deserves longer. I don't know. He's up for dispute. But no matter how terrible he was, he cannot deserve eternity in hell. And no matter how awesome you might be, you cannot deserve eternal bliss. That is something that is simply beyond the capacity for basic retributive justice. It blows the notion of scales out of the water. Either you will be punished more than you deserve, or you will be rewarded more than you deserve. And the standard story of the afterlife gives you no third option. There is a third option, though, if we reject that, and it's an option that comes from the 19th century German existentialist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He who was famous for proclaiming the death of God. After he proclaimed the death of God, one of the big philosophical things that Nietzsche was wrestling with is how can we find a point of orientation? How can we know which way is up and which way is down? What is right and what is wrong? How to live versus how not to live if there is no God. God has been our magnetic north, our orientation point for so long. Now that we no longer have him, how do we orient our lives? And this is what Nietzsche proposed. Nietzsche says he wants you to imagine that a spirit comes to you on your deathbed and tells you that you have to spend eternity reliving your life as you have lived it up to this point all over again, start to finish. Every single detail, every single moment, exactly the same as it was as you just lived it. And the question that Nietzsche wants you to ask yourself is, do you see this spirit as an angel or as a demon? Is this a blessing or a curse in your mind? And as Nietzsche sees it, if you answer curse, if you answer demon, you're doing something wrong with your life. You're not living life in a way that is going to be authentically yours. Nietzsche wants to encourage you to change your pattern, do something different so you can actually say to this creature, you are an angel. I can imagine nothing better than to be given the gift of my own life. The gift of my own life. Now, Nietzsche, of course, does not actually think this is going to happen. He does not believe in some sort of eternal recurrence in any sort of metaphysical sense. It's a thought experiment designed to get you to reflect on how you are living your life and to get you to hopefully make changes in your life if you are living in such a way that the prospect of eternal recurrence is not appealing to you. And Nietzsche thinks this is the best way to go about having that orientation, to living a life and to having a sense of justice. We no longer have to live up to God's standards. We have to live up to our own standards. We have to find a way to make peace with ourselves, to live our lives again and again and again, because then our life becomes truly our life. We take ownership of it in a way that we do not and cannot if when we die, we all return to God. And that, in Nietzsche's mind at least, is a very beautiful thing, and I at least am inclined to agree with him. Okay, what about the prospect of meaning? How does that play into this thing? Well, animation's a little screwed up. Once more, again, acknowledging the basic point. Everything that we do with our lives will ultimately be undone by time. Really, in a very real sense, it does not matter what we do, because eventually it will be erased. And we can write the great American novel, we can climb Mount Everest, we can fall in love, we can have children, we can walk on the moon. And sooner or later, eventually, when enough time passes, even if it isn't until the heat death of the universe, it's going to be undone. All our accomplishments will be wiped out eventually. And it is incredibly difficult to see how we can have meaning in our life with that foreknowledge, with the recognition that everything that we do will ultimately be obliterated. Another existentialist philosopher, Albert Camus, takes the central image of the myth of Sisyphus as a metaphor for the struggle for human beings to find meaning in life. And Sisyphus pushes the rock up the hill, and at the end of the day, it rolls right back down again. And he has to push it back up the next day. An eternity of pointless toil, says Camus, is the worst possible torture you can imagine. But that's all that we have to look forward to. No matter how hard we struggle, no matter how much we accomplish, it will be erased. And it's for this purpose that another existentialist philosopher, the Dutch existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, says that we need to take a leap of faith to God in order to have any meaning in our lives. Kierkegaard's take on this is in some ways similar to mine. He actually says it almost doesn't even matter whether or not God exists, but it does matter incredibly that we believe in him. It matters incredibly that we commit ourselves to him. Because even if he doesn't exist, the only way we can find meaning in our lives is by that commitment. And in many ways, what I'm doing here today is just to try to sort of reverse that whole direction. So even if God does exist, we're much better if we do not make that leap of faith, if we do not have that commitment. So how then? Well, I'm going to start by stealing a line here from the philosopher Thomas Nagel and his really interesting and enlightening essay, The Absurd. So again, once more, I will quote him at length here. It is often remarked that nothing we do now will matter in a million years. But if that's true, then by the same token, nothing that will be the case in a million years matters now. In particular, it does not matter now that in a million years, nothing we do now will matter. If their mattering now is not enough to make them matter, how would it help if they mattered a million years from now? In other words, the idea here that somehow our actions and our lives have to have some sort of cosmic significance, some sort of eternal significance, seems philosophically dubious, to say the least. It is undeniable, to me at least, that our lives have meaning now. Now, how they have meaning and in what sense they have meaning is philosophically very, very puzzling. I will definitely grant you that. But it is as clear to me as the hands in front of me that my life has meaning, and I assume that you guys experience the same thing. You understand why you get up in the morning, why it is that you do what you do, go to work, go to school. That has significance and value to you. How it can have that, yeah, kind of a mystery, but it has it. That much seems undeniable. Why should it matter whether or not that extends on to eternity? Why do we need this sort of sense of ultimate meaning in order to recognize that when I look at a beautiful sunset, that moves me, and that matters to me? Yeah, someday that sun is going to die out. Someday this planet will freeze over, or shatter, or dissolve, or whatever the fate of the planet will be, will no longer be here, but that doesn't change the fact that in that moment, the sunset is beautiful. So, to come back to something that I mentioned before, if we die with God, then think about grief. Go back to the death of your loved ones, the death of people who you've loved. If we die lowercase d with God, then we should never feel grief. Grief is wholly irrational if we die with God. Because, well, quite frankly, if there's a heaven, then dying is the best thing that could ever happen to anybody. Assuming they go to heaven, of course. Let's assume that for the sake of argument. If they go to heaven, then everything that happens in heaven is infinitely superior than anything that happens here. You could die the day before your wedding, and you would be happier in heaven than you would be at your wedding. Dying the day before your wedding is a massive improvement than actually going ahead and getting married, because heaven is just that much better. Anytime we hear about anyone dying, we should rejoice. We should say, this is fantastic and wonderful. They are now one with God, and we're happy for them. But we're not actually happy. When that happens, we know intimately and immediately that we're not happy. We feel terrible. We feel torn apart. And frankly, we should feel torn apart. We should not rejoice when people die, because we understand they've lost something profound. So if heaven is real, if we die with God, then nothing in this life really matters. It's as long as we get into heaven, you know, as long as we do whatever we have to do, jump through whatever hoops is necessary to get into heaven, everything else is superfluous. Everything else is besides the point. No matter how awesome or fantastic it is, no matter how seemingly profound or meaningful it is to you, it means nothing in the face of heaven. So, you know, I refer to this as the problem of grief. The idea that grief seems like it's a morally important emotion. It seems like it's something that should have a role in our moral psychology. We use the thought of dying with God to comfort ourselves, to deal with the pain. But quite frankly, it is just too comforting. It anesthetizes us completely to any sort of pain. And when we anesthetize ourselves to pain, we anesthetize ourselves to pleasure as well. This is something which ends up just obliterating and abolishing the notion that our lives are going to have any kind of significance. I mean, if I sincerely believe that my dead, lowercase d, dead loved ones aren't really dead, capital D, then I have no reason to feel regret. I have no reason to feel sorrow. Sooner or later, I'm going to die too, and I will rejoin them. So that really, the prospect of their death should give me no cause or fear or anxiety at all. It really is the best possible thing that could have happened to them. So I shouldn't care about their deaths. I shouldn't care about my death. In fact, I shouldn't even care about my life. I should have a hope that I die as soon as possible. You know, I should hope that I come down with some very, very fast form of terminal cancer, so I can shuffle loose this mortal coil and move on to the next life where things get really good. That would be a wonderful thing for me. And there are some people who believe this. There are some people who live like this, but I think there are very few and far between. I think the fact that the majority of people, even people who proclaim to believe in an afterlife, don't live this way. And the fact that when they lose a loved one, they do feel sorrow and remorse in spite of their protestations that he's in a better place or what have you. I think they recognize that if it all comes out in the wash, then it really doesn't matter. But they know that it matters. They know that it matters intimately and immediately, so they don't really believe that it all comes out in the wash. They don't really believe that there is an eternal paradisaical afterlife. Someone else who stole this line before me was the Argentinian short story writer Jorge Luis Borges in his short story, The Immortal. I don't want to quote him as well. I have noticed that in spite of religion, the conviction as to one's own immortality is extraordinarily rare. Jews, Christians, and Muslims all profess belief in immortality, but the veneration paid to the first century of life is proof that they truly believe only in those 100 years, for they destine all the rest throughout eternity to rewarding or punishing what they did when alive. Borges, of course, is hard to beat. His poetry certainly trumps mine, so I won't even comment on that. I'll simply move on to yet another poet. And this poet is Wallace Stevens, who has a fantastic line from the poem. He says, "Death is the mother of beauty." And I think it's worth unpacking that idea. Death is the mother of beauty. It is again, seemingly strange notion, because we're inclined to think of death as a terrible thing, and beauty is a wonderful thing. How can death be the mother of beauty? Well, think about Beethoven for a moment. Beethoven went deaf in the middle of his life, and at the height of his career. And at the point when he could no longer hear the applause that was generated by his own music, he had to knock the legs off his piano and put it on the floor so he could hear the vibrations of the music through the floor. And that was how he composed his Fifth Symphony. Now, you've all heard the Fifth Symphony before. It is a stirring piece of music, one of the most famous pieces of music in history. It's powerful, it's emotional, and and you can just feel Beethoven's frustration and his anger and his grief at this incredible thing. This thing was the center of his life, his capacity to hear, and it's now gone, and it's taken from him, and the injustice and the unfairness of that is just tearing him up. And that's why you get dun 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 dun, dun 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 dun. That is just the distilled audio form of torment, anguish, and grief. Now imagine a hypothetical world in which Beethoven never went deaf, or in which he died before he went deaf and before he composed the Fifth Symphony. In that world where Beethoven doesn't write the Fifth Symphony, the music that he does write, or he would have written it if he had lived, it would have been very different. I don't doubt for a second it still would have been beautiful and brilliant music, but it would have been very different than the Fifth Symphony. It would not have had that feeling of anger and frustration and grief. That was something that, it seems to me, in my admittedly limited understanding of Beethoven's biography, was a turning point in his life that really made him the composer that he was when he wrote the Fifth Symphony. To really get the extent of this, you can tell similar stories too about people like Wagner, Schubert, and Jim Morrison, and Kurt Cobain, and Ian Curtis, and these are just the musicians, to say nothing of the painters, and the sculptors, and the architects, the novelists, and the poets, and the short story writers, or even for that matter, just everyday people. The things that we grow and gain from these pains, and these frustrations, and these griefs, and these losses is a large part of what makes our life so moving and so profound. These emotions are crucial to our sense of self. They are crucial to our understanding of who we are as human beings. To feel that pain is to be alive. Now let's say we die and transcend into God's kingdom. Can we feel that pain anymore? Can you hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in heaven? If I can sort of steal a line from Nietzsche, I don't think I could not believe in a heaven in which Beethoven's Fifth Symphony did not exist. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to me that you can really hear it without feeling that pain, without feeling that frustration. If you don't feel that, you're not listening to Beethoven's Fifth. You don't hear it. So either there has to be pain in heaven, or there cannot be the Fifth Symphony. And it seems to me that it's a difficult position for at least the traditional theist to break that divide. They have to accept one or the other. And no doubt some will be comfortable with one, some will be comfortable with the other, but I think the majority will find themselves in quite a pickle trying to make sense of that. So, I think that is what Stevens means when he says death is the mother of beauty. That it is that sense of loss, that sense of tragedy, that elevates us and inspires us to create such stunning works of beauty as Beethoven's Fifth. Okay, fifth and final point now. The notion that when we die with God, we get all the answers. Now, I have spent most of my life struggling to find answers to questions that have vexed me and perplexed me. I have made considerable sacrifices and in exchange achieved fairly modest accomplishments. The prospect of being able to know, to understand, to get the answers, to figure out the life, the universe, and everything. Once more, I understand the attraction of this. I understand that prospect. To have a theory of everything, a sense of why the world is the way it is and how it works, and to have all of that is definitely alluring. It's definitely tempting. But at the same time, I feel inasmuch as it is seductive, it is equal parts destructive and fundamentally unhealthy for us. I mean, I do want answers, but do I really want all the answers? Think about what that means for a moment. Everything. You come to know everything. That means there will be nothing left to wonder about, nothing left to ponder, nothing left to investigate or explore. Eternity is the death of curiosity. And suddenly that does not sound anywhere near as appealing to me. A large part of what makes our lives worthwhile, what makes our lives valuable, is the fact that we mature, that we develop, we struggle, we learn, we are set back and we grow stronger. These experiences make us who we are. We grow through challenge and obstacle and resistance. This is a large part of what life is about. And much of the value comes from taking risks and from struggling and from sacrificing to learn things that we didn't know before. All of this is pointless if the answers are in the back of the book. Why bother going to school if everything you will ever need to know you will learn upon your death? What is the point in reading a book if when you die you will osmosize that book and every other book that has ever been written? You will forget lots of things that you struggle really hard to learn in this life, but once you die, you will remember it all. Why bother with the stuff that you're going to forget anyway if you're going to learn it all when it comes time to everything coming in the back? I love this image, this language I'm stealing, by the way, from once more from Tom Stoppard. This idea of the answers being in the back of the book. I find that to be a perfectly apt metaphor for this proposal. And I say straightforward, I don't want the answers to be in the back of the book. Because that nullifies all the sacrifices, all the work, everything that I've spent trying to find the answers for myself. It ends up being pointless, because you don't need to sacrifice. You don't need to struggle. All you need to do is die. Just go home and die, and everything that you ever wondered will be answered for you. In heaven, there is nothing left to imagine, nothing left to dream, nothing left to do. And that seems like a pretty terrible proposal to me. So I don't think that we really want to live forever. I don't think that we want to lowercase d die with God. And this is once more something I think Friedrich Nietzsche would agree with me about. Nietzsche argues that if there is an afterlife, then this life can have no meaning or value. Nothing that we experience, no matter how fantastic, can possibly compare to heaven. Our greatest accomplishments, our greatest bliss here on earth is torturous hell in comparison to the wonder and glory of the afterlife. I hope I can speak for you in saying that we want our successes and our failures, our lives, our pleasures and our pains to matter, to make a difference. But if they are all outshined by the final act, once more, if it all comes out in the wash, then they can't matter. They can't make a difference. Because we all end up in heaven, and everything's perfect and blissful there one way or the other. So, to use the same list I used before, it doesn't matter on this understanding if I write a great novel, if I fall in love, if I travel the world, appreciate Shakespeare, learn a foreign language, or walk on the moon. The only thing that matters is that I am saved. The only thing that matters is that I get into heaven. Everything else is dispensable. Everything else is superfluous. But everything else is life. Everything else is what we live for. It's for the look in your child's eyes when they're reading a book for the first time that they genuinely invest themselves in. It's the experience you have when the person that you love looks back into your eyes and everything else about the world melts away, and you are just there. None of that matters. Love, family, commitment, connection, growth, education, learning, none of that matters if the afterlife will take it all away. I want to quote yet another person here, the novelist Paul Bowles, who I think put the point rather beautifully. Bowles writes in his novel, The Sheltering Sky, "Because we do not know when we will die, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. Yet everything happens only a certain number of times, and a very small number, really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood, an afternoon that is so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it? Perhaps 4, 5 times more, perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20, and yet it all seems so limitless." It does seem so limitless. When we don't dwell on the fact that someday we will die, it does seem limitless. And when I read these words, I want to relish those moments. I want to relish the times when I think about my childhood, I watch the full moon rise. But if this life is just a dress rehearsal, if it's just a test, if it's just a precursor to the real show, then I don't need to do that. It's kind of pointless, because I'm going to get as many moonrises as I want. I will literally have an infinity of moonrises to look forward to. There's plenty more where that came from. That should be your attitude towards everything. If you really believe there's an afterlife, nothing could be relished or cherished or seen as precious. Because every time you see a full moon rise, your reaction should be, there's plenty more where that came from. Life is an inexhaustible well on this picture. And that means that, well, basically it's all trivia. The only thing that makes anything precious or special or beautiful is finitude. It's the idea that there is only a limited amount of it. Superabundance of anything makes it worthless. Pick anything you want. Money, diamonds, poetry, art. If you had an infinite amount of it, it would mean nothing. It is only because these things are finite that we can relish them, that we can come to appreciate them in this deep and profound sense. And figuring out how to make sense of our lives in the face of that finitude is really, in no short measure, what life is all about. If we can die with God, then we go out the same way we came in. And we might as well have never lived at all. Because nothing really matters. It's all about heaven, nothing about this life that makes a difference. So in closing, I've gone over my time, I appreciate your patience. I want to reiterate the point again in the first person. I want my life to matter. I want my struggles, my accomplishments, my failures, and my setbacks to matter. And I don't think they can if I will never, capital D, die. If my existence will never completely come to a close. Dying without God, then, is the only way that we can genuinely have passion and exuberance. The only way we can soak in all the beauty and the wonder and the majesty of life. If the answers are in the back of the book, if this is just a dress rehearsal, if life is an inexhaustible well, then it's not possible to savor the mystery. It's not possible to relish the waters, because there's plenty more where that came from. Our lives are brief, all too brief, but that is what makes them precious. And an honest recognition that our lives will someday end in completeness, utter oblivion, is the only way to recognize that our lives are worth living. So dying without God does not lead us to nihilism, quite the opposite. It leads us to embracing life, precisely because someday it will end and we will be no more. When we die without God, we recognize that this life is the only one we will ever have, and that puts us in a position to cherish it. And so that's what I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with the recommendation to cherish life. Thank you all very much.